Thank you indeed, Christopher. And if any member would like to speak from the dispatch box at the next debate, please do check the email, and details on how to do so are on there. Moving back to the opposition then. Our second speaker in opposition tonight is Poppy Coburn. Poppy is the assistant US opinion editor at the Telegraph and a writer for the Express, conservative Home and Unherd. Her recent article, Why I Gave Up on Extinction Rebellion, details her opposition to performative anti-capitalism. Poppy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. If I could just push back, and it's a slightly pedantic point on the first proposition speaker. We're talking about the funding of policy exchange. Just Stop Oil is also funded by big oil. It's funded by the Getty family. In fact, many of the large environmental protest groups, including Extinction Rebellion, it's the first minute, sorry, but if you wait 30 seconds, I'll get you, are also funded by major fossil fuel heiresses, or heirs, normally heiresses. But anyway, getting back to it, this seems to be quite a hysterical debate for a bunch of people who've basically already won. I mean, really, what more do you want? The government's already passed the Net Zero Act. It's legally binding. It was passed by a conservative government. It locks us into a certain set of environmental precepts until 2030. Sure, why not?
So, when this government is actively going back on its promises under the Net Zero Act, how can you say that this government is, agreeing with the climate protesters?
Well, I was going to get on with the importance of democracy here, because the vast majority of people in Britain are going to face real consequences for the protest that we find very enjoyable. Sorry, please, I'll get into the flow, and I promise I'll come to you. Thanks. If I'll be frank, if I thought that one day I'd be arguing here against an unlimited right to protest, I wouldn't have quite believed you. I was also here at Cambridge University and one of those awful Oxbridge privileged students. My time here at university was centred around direct action and agitation. I was the most self-indulgent middle-class hooligan you could find. I marched up and down King's Parade on behalf of Cambridge Zero Carbon. I cheered on the illegal occupation of Senate House and the vandalisation of university property. I wouldn't dare position myself in the long tradition of meaningful political action in Britain. I was a jumped-up student radical, after all. But I hope that I can provide some insight into the reality of modern direct action protest, who they serve, why it's effective, and how it's separate from a genuine system of civil exchange. Protest is romantic, particularly when the personal stakes are so low and the rhetorical justification for it is so high-minded. So let's tear apart that romanticism. An organised minority always rules over a disorganised minority. Attempts to drive change from the bottom up, in absence of elite organisation, think of the Yellow Vest protests in France, for example, amount to little more than incoherent rabble. The government is perfectly harsh on protests that we all seem to condemn, and by we, I mean outside of the rarefied confines of Cambridge University. I doubt many, if any of the people in the room, will be particularly sympathetic towards anti-vaxxers, or immigration restrictionalists, or Christian anti-abortionalists. If that does describe you, congratulations, you do have the weight of the British state behind you. Don't worry about protesting. There are two forms of protest. The ideal type, that's associated with whitewashed histories of morally acceptable causes. And then there are the unpleasant types, the second, nastier form, those who are, for now, on the wrong side of history, wretched and unfashionable. Contemporary example of this divide could be between movements we saw in 2021. We can look at the racial agitation after the murder of George Floyd, and we can look at the anti-lockdown protests. This is not just a debate over disruption of ordinary people's lives. All protest is disruptive. That is in its very nature. To complain solely of inconvenience is to open oneself up to the obvious rebuttal that some temporary disruption is justified, on the basis that inaction would lead to far greater disruption in the long term. This is the argument made, clumsily, I think, by Just Stop Oil. Now, we may quibble over the details of how supergluing one's hand to a painting speeds up Britain's commitment to a net zero future. But I believe, just as my supervisor once questioned how my inability to hand in an essay because I was marching down King's Parade would help me solve the marketisation of higher education crisis, that slogans like direct action gets the goods and a riot is the language of unheard makes us feel good. Protest in this country is frankly mostly passive and peaceful. It's more resembling a fun day out than an existential struggle for existence. And if the stakes are indeed so low, a little bit of disruption, a few milkshakes thrown over paintings or objectionable politicians, can we really justify introducing new legislation against it? Well, our social system works according to the idea that the state and society are separate, that the state is a neutral body which performs the will of society, and that the will of society is established through non-violent debate. Sure.
I just just want to call into question how representative your experience of protest has been. You're talking all the time about, oh, I was this like upper middle class girl having a lovely time in King's Parade. I mean, how much, describing it as a day out, how much of a fun day out do you think it was for the miners striking?
Oh, that's sweet. Well, I mean, I was arrested on behalf of Extinction Rebellion. I'm not actually upper middle class. What I'm trying to say here is... You talked about the Israel-Palestine debate. Do you have any particular connection to this, or is this a proxy?
Pictures of Hamas leaders, despite being a Jew. So you just said, oh, people who are able
Point
to
of order.
It's
It's not a question.
Sure.
It's not a point of information. You don't have to take it. You don't have to take it.
Sorry, we're going back on Israel-Palestine. I think James is going to talk about that, so I'm going to save this for his one, if that's okay.
Really believe that there's a problem, and perhaps we should focus on this problem instead of basically justifying the atrocities that are across the globe and trying to restrict the freedom to demonstrate.
Sorry, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I better get back onto track. So let's go back to the example of the green environmentalist movement. Frankly, it's something I know more about, so I won't try and speak on things I don't understand fully. Let's look to the example of the green movement. It was the same movement that I was once enthusiastically protesting alongside. And I can think of no greater sign of the hollowness of invocations of preserving civil liberties against supposed government tyranny than this. Many of the actions of a group like Just Stop Oil are intended to disrupt, if not outright terrorise. They're not a protest or free speech. Free speech refers to potentially falsifiable statements intended to persuade a voluntary audience. I cannot argue with someone who sits down in the middle of the road and gets a policeman to arrest me if I disagree. There is no potential for debate here, and hence no utilitarian or other reason to tolerate it. If blockading private citizens is free speech, then throwing manure in my neighbour's garden is also free speech. Environmental activist groups participate in activities which would otherwise be liable for criminal prosecution under the direct protection of the British state. If I do decide to blockade my neighbour's front drive as a private citizen, I can and will be taken to court for it. But Just Stop Oil do this for ideological purposes, and anybody stopping them is arrested for assault by the state. This is why the law had to change from the government. When they stand trial, judges refuse to sentence them, and barristers refuse to prosecute them because they agree with this ideology. Barristers, mind you, like our fellow debater Jolyon Morgan, who was part of a 120-strong group of leading lawyers who declared that they would refuse to prosecute climate protesters. Now, sometimes the law is wrong, and you're right. In your Guardian polemic, I did agree with that. That's true. But by what mechanism should the enforcement of law be changed? Should it be done by Parliament, and the law should be applied the same to everybody, or should it be applied on the basis of the whim of the conscience of a barrister? I shall now quote from Lord Hoffman's opinion about the importance of the right to protest and the unspoken agreement between police and protester. And this was stated between the House of Lords in 2006. I was also in primary school when this was done. Civil disobedience on conscientious grounds has a long and honourable history in this country. But there are conventions which are generally accepted by lawbreakers on one side and law enforcers on the other. The protesters behave with a sense of proportion and do not cause excessive damage or inconvenience. And they vouch the sincerity of their beliefs by accepting the penalties imposed by the law. The police and prosecutors, on the other hand, behave with restraint. By causing never-ending disruption, out of all proportion to the number of protesters, in order to raise awareness of an issue already at the heart of both government and opposition policy, Just Stop Oil has not held up its side of the bargain. And while the police and prosecutors must continue to act with restraint, that may seem to look a lot like spinelessness. Is it the supposed right of an octogenarian pensioner to glue herself to the M25 supreme over the right of the misguided, ignorant commuter driving his car to work? Sorry, I've already taken a few. Do the police have a responsibility to babysit these on fixed incomes determined to break the law? And if so, for how long? How many of you will stand up for the rights of the anti-vaxxers, the immigration restrictionists? Do they have the same protections? AstroTurf consensus is corrosive to political legitimacy. I would argue that Britain is suffering immensely from it. The British state is set up in such a way that those who make policy have no stake in implementing it, and those who implement it have no stake in making it. It is expertly designed to induce learned helplessness and the serial abnegation of responsibility. This is what we call government by stakeholder. Political ideologies work by tapping into popular social forces to force interest-oriented institutions to change. They combine serious policy ideas with catchwords and slogans that appeal to the hopes and fears of ordinary people. All successful protest movements have relied on some degree to elite support to succeed. It is this distinction between those who command this support and those who do not that distinguishes between protests as a genuine last-ditch avenue for the voiceless and those determined to hijack the public sphere for a self-indulgent victory lap. Return back to the beginning. How juvenile it must have seemed to those who were witnessing the 1968 student protest, these jumped-up fools play acting at revolution. But the world today is quite different from that of 1968. Could it now be that our protesters are themselves reactionary? And how many of those radicals, failing to find their promised revolution, downed tools and entered the administrative state? We seem to have entered a new age of protest, one entirely divorced from mass politics. We don't engage with the people. We don't appeal to the masses. Instead, we appeal to nebulous government stakeholders, those who already agree with us, know that we are moral and know that we are good. I was guided by an unerring belief in the correctness of my own brilliant ideas. After all, I was entirely insulated from consequences of my own actions, coddled both by university administrators and later the British state. And I'm ashamed of my arrogance, my foolishness in thinking that I could impose my half-formed beliefs onto a majority without regard for debate and due process. But then again, I was only 19. I hope the rest of the proposition will too grow out of it. Thank you.
Well done. Very good.